And there's Molly. Excellent. So first of all, welcome. I know everyone on the screen, but before we got going, I wanted to allow everyone to introduce yourselves and what towns you're from, just in case people don't know who you are. So to start that off, I'm John Hagan from Guilford, and I am the chair for the Wyndham Town Committee. I'll go ahead and hand it off to David Levenbach to introduce himself.
David Levenbach from Brattleboro.
Okay. Bob?
Bob Lozier, Brattleboro.
Brattleboro and Witchy?
Witchy Arto, pronouncing him his datum theirs, Athens.
Athens. And Emily?
Emily Kornheiser from Brattleboro, she, her pronouns.
Liz?
Liz McLaughlin, Brattleboro. I'm also the chair of the Brattleboro Dems.
And Molly?
Molly Burke, State Representative, Brattleboro.
Okay. And saving the best for last, Andy and Elise.
Elise, Elise and
Andy Burrows, and I'm the chair in Guilford.
Both from Guilford. So
And we
again,
shared a picnic table at the farmer's market on
We did.
Saturday.
Yep.
excellent. So thank you, by the way, everyone for coming. I've said it to a few people already. This is the first of 9 of these listening sessions I'm doing. So I'm a little bit nervous about how they go, but I'm very excited to have a group like this to have the first discussion going, because this will set me up well for as we move into the others. If you would pass this along to colleagues, friends, family, you don't have to be from a particular town to attend any of the sessions. They're really open to any Democrat leaning, Democrat interested people from the county. And the intent is, you know, the legislative session is done for the year. There's no election campaigns in the near future. We really have a moment here this summer to kind of reflect on who we are as a party, where we're going, what our values are, and how we're presenting publicly, and how we could do things different. I mean, we have this kind of moment to imagine that space. And so my intent tonight was, if we could, I wanted to explore both the platform planks of the Democratic Committee, or Vermont Democratic Party, and how they present themselves. Do they present themselves to you as individuals in your different towns in terms of both values and issues? And then how does the party itself show up for you? And that's more of an organizational discussion at the end. When you think party, do you think automatically your legislature? Or is there other things where you see evidence of a Democratic Party? So those were the 2 areas: values, issues, and then the second was this organizational discussion. This is a small group, so I'm not worried about hand raising features, but if you just want to raise your hand and shake, that's fine. Reminder, feel free to be critical, but we want to be respectful of everyone, even people who aren't on the screen. And I want to make sure everyone has an opportunity to speak. So when you're speaking, just be mindful that there'll be others as well. So
John, can I interrupt for a minute? I invited somebody to come, Wendy Harrison. If you see her name.
When I see her, I will let her in. Absolutely. Wendy and I serve on the Sheriff's Advisory Council together, so I know her well. Good. So I wanted to start with, if you don't mind, I should go ahead and share my screen just to bring up the party platform planks. You should be able to see those right there. And there's 7 of them. And what I wanted to do was, first of all, kind of explore them as a large group of and we're not the platform committee, but that gives us the space to kind of go, are we covering everything as Democrats we think should be covered? And then kind of look through them a little bit more individually in terms of how they show up for us as individuals in our own homes, in our own lives, or how they don't show up, even more importantly, maybe. And just kind of consider, as Democrats, if we say these are our platform planks, what does that exactly mean? So starting, first of all, is there any thoughts on that before we get moving? If I'm missing a good question I should be asking. You guys are the test case on this, so. Okay, not yet. Okay, so,
Oh, so I have no idea what education second to none means.
okay. Yeah, I did pull the titles and not the, this is one of those few times where Democrats usually say too much. I just pulled the titles off the platform and not the larger platform description, which goes on for about a page. But the intent, I think, is about quality education for everyone in Vermont. This is the gist of it if I boiled it down. But in terms of the topics, equity, economic prosperity, environmental justice, healthcare, justice and community safety, education, democracy, are there other issues that we as Democrats might be wanting to think about?
Maybe I'm just throwing that out there, and maybe because I'm from Athens in a Brattleboro Guilford committee meeting, but
Go ahead.
just thinking about rural development.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Yeah, so when you think of prosperity for all, which let me tease on that a little bit. What is that usually saying when you hear something like that, or when you think about what Democrats say about prosperity or economic development? What are you associating with that?
I think of a double-edged sword. I mean, now that I see prosperity for all, it's like, oh yeah, rural development should probably go under that. And at the same time, I hold the fact that a lot of prosperity gets centered and distributed through the urban centers of the counties, like Brattleboro.
It's a very big subject, a very complicated subject, obviously. And it has a lot to do with equity. Just the fact that it's not just prosperity, but prosperity for all. I would like to just point out that Guilford is also pretty rural. Although somebody is building a house next to me, which is going to make it a little bit more suburban, but the things that will help prosperity in rural Vermont are obviously issues of communication, making it possible for people to work in Athens, and whatever their work might be, in the financial institutions, or, you know, there are lots of things that one can do from home. And that's prosperity for all suggests to me the need to define what's needed to build prosperity and work towards those things. Yes, there's prosperity. Prosperity seems to come from our commercial center, that being Brattleboro, but you might question that going down Main Street in Brattleboro. You know, half the stores are empty. And that's partly because prosperity in Brattleboro depends very heavily on prosperity in the surrounding towns of the county. And of course, across the river and in other parts of the northern parts of Massachusetts. But it's, what do we do to attract more people to make a living throughout Windham County and throughout Vermont, and make a good living? And that's the essence of prosperity for all, it seems to me.
find myself wondering what rural prosperity means as a Democrat,
Yeah.
very specifically. Because I know very clearly what the Republican argument is for prosperity for all. You know, it's removing regulatory barriers, or adding tax credits or things like that. And so when I think about what equity or prosperity for all means in a rural area for Democrats, I have my own theories, but I don't really necessarily see them as sort of part of the party platform. And so I'm curious what that means to people.
One of the factors I think is broadband.
Mhm.
You know, access to broadband for people both in Brattleboro and in rural areas has been shown, especially this year, to be so important for people to work and study. And
I'm curious on, so broadband's an interesting one to look at in terms of, is that I mean, broadband is not a partisan issue, but it definitely gets a partisan framing. You know, you know, with every one of these, I like Molly's or Emily's kind of phrasing of what does this mean as a Democrat? Because that is where I think we are kind of challenged, is when we're out there saying, hey, vote Democrat. We want people to have an idea in their mind of, oh, when I think of Democrats and prosperity, we should have an idea of what they're thinking. What are they thinking when we think Democrats and environment? So Liz, could you expand a little bit on broadband in that framing?
well, you know, it's interesting because, you know, maybe 2 years ago when Brattleboro was considering joining the communications union, you know, I thought it was a peripheral issue because most of Brattleboro is served. But, you know, now that the state is giving money to, you know, to increase access for all the towns surrounding Brattleboro, and it would include Brattleboro, you know, I see it much more as an equity issue, especially with the pandemic, when people from the more rural areas of Windham County did not have access to even something as basic as, you know, the library. You know, a lot of people come into Brattleboro to use the Wi-Fi. So it's a basic element for everyone to work and to gain services and to be educated and so forth. So I think the pandemic definitely highlighted that issue as an equality issue, an equity issue.
Would you go as far to say broadband is a public good?
Yes.
I mean, is that something again, we're not building the platform. I'm just trying to kind of explore, you know, where are our values at when it comes to these, you know, what are the values that underlie these planks or that come off these planks?
Yes, I would, especially, you know, in the past year that everyone really needed, you know, computer access to be a part of the community.
As usual, it seems to me that Emily's really hit the nail on the head. The democratic values can be said to be different from the quotes traditional Republican conservative values of cutting regulations and cutting spending and living as close to the bone as possible, and assuming that, you know, we don't have to worry about everybody having much prosperity. We don't have to force it so that people can make a living in other places. If they want to make a living doing some things, they'll move to Brattleboro or work in Brattleboro. And it just seems to me wrong-minded that we do need regulations. We need regulations to make sure that healthcare is handled correctly for everybody. We need regulations to set up the traditions of education, the Vermont tradition of education for everybody, which goes all the way back to the Constitution, but make sure that it is for everybody. You can't just come up with a phrase. You have to have a certain amount of regulation and control to make sure that people who are BIPOC or whatever they might be get a chance at a decent education along with everybody else. Environmental justice is impossible without regulation. And obviously, we can't go forward without spending money. That's what taxation is about. And I hate to say it, but I think in general, Democrats are in favor of taxing people for the good of the community and having people vote for the things that they want, but it takes taxation. We have to support it. And we can't just wait for the federal government or some beneficent corporation to give us a whole bunch of money.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Witchy, I see your hand up.
Molly hasn't spoken yet, and I feel like Molly also raised her hand. Molly, do you want to go first?
Okay, sure. Molly?
Thank you. No, I think it's pretty much saying what Andy said. How do you look at, prosperity for all or whatever, any of these as a democratic issue? And I think it's the means by which you accomplish them. And I think that's basically what you were saying, Andy, is
Yep.
Believing in investment, believing in like not leaving it up to the to the telecom companies to provide the broadband, but making sure that those things happen. So I think the taxation is really very critical.
Thanks, Molly. Witchy?
Yeah, I think there's something really beautiful, I think, about what everyone's saying, with Liz and Andy and Molly. And I sort of what I want to join sort of what Liz and Andy was saying first to say, it's not just like access to broadband, right? It's access to quality communication services, which is broadband, which is cell service, which is, making sure you have electricity so you can have internet. So it's all of these different things that play together in order to be able to have access to this. I thought a lot about these different types of platforms and what we're really trying to say with equity. When Molly's saying about investing, and the question is, what are we investing in? And I think what we're investing is opportunity. Our platform is about creating access to quality opportunity, to equitable opportunity, and for access to it. So I think there's something to be really powerful to be unified around that kind of thinking.
Which I think that's a really great phrasing of not just investing in access to opportunity, but access to quality opportunity that actually has a meaning, not just, hey, you can send your kid to a private school, here's a stipend, but you're not going to afford to go anyway. Welcome to your opportunity. Emily, I see your hand up.
On that thread of sort of access to opportunity and tying it to the thread from Liz before about broadband, I think something I've really appreciated from the Biden administration and really sort of building on some Green New Deal rhetoric is this idea that infrastructure can be thought of as something beyond the physical, that it can be thought of as social or human. And things like family medical leave and accessible, affordable childcare are just as important for government to support as broadband and electricity, because that's sort of that's what enables access to quality opportunity for all Vermonters. And so I appreciate that sort of, I think that's something that we've talked about on the margins, but I appreciate how much it's really being named in upcoming federal legislation. And I think that's a really important thread for Vermont Democrats to keep holding on to.
That idea of the human component of infrastructure, that it's not just the building, it's the people in the building.
And that we don't do it because it's necessarily the right thing to do or because we're socialists, but we do it because it creates an environment where everyone can thrive.
So we've been staying pretty much in the economic realm at the moment, and we've touched a little bit on equity. Before we move on, any other thoughts on the economic? And by the way, Tristan Teleno entered. I didn't get a chance to welcome Tristan. Oh, he's here. So
Put my hand up.
how about health? There he is. I'd like to kind of look at healthcare as well, because that has been definitely an issue for Democrats that have, I mean, all of these have been challenging. But how, what does democratic healthcare look like? What is that? We've looked at broadband, but let's shift over to the healthcare for a minute.
Well, basically, democratic healthcare is not killing Obamacare. Maintaining it, expanding it, making sure that everybody has not only insurance, but actually access to healthcare. I think we've all seen, again, in the pandemic, all the ways that our public healthcare system, public health has fallen short.
Witchy, I see your hand up.
Andy had his hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. My screen doesn't always show the scroll. So thank you for helping me on that one. Andy.
I was just looking at the planks, and I know this isn't a plank, but it seems to me that the concept of the big tent party is extremely important in Vermont. And Vermont is actually a small community from one end to the other, from Massachusetts to Canada. There aren't that many of us, and we have lots of different ideas, and we have lots of different issues. And to the extent that we can be inclusive and respectful of other people's concerns and their solutions, we are a stronger party. And if I know it's a political thing to say, but that's all right. It seems all right to me anyway. Basically, most of the things that we have talked about over many years in which I've been involved, and fully half of the Democratic committee in Guilford are openly progressive. That doesn't mean that they're members of the Progressive Party, which is trying to establish itself as a party. It's a matter of concept. It's a matter of aggressively trying to solve problems. And if I were somehow magically going to add a plank, it would be inclusiveness in the political and democratic dialogue. And maybe that fits in under democracy, because that is what democracy is. We welcome people from the demos, from the people, to speak up and share their ideas, whether we agree with them or not, and come up with solutions that we can stand behind. And I think we've done pretty well.
Andy, you anticipated actually for the second half that the first organizational question I really wanted to look at was, what exactly do we mean as a big tent party, and how does that show up? But
Sorry.
so no, I'm glad you teased that one out. We'll definitely be coming back into that. Richard, do you want to go?
Yeah, about healthcare, I think I want to bring two things into this conversation and kind of join them. I think first, just citing that there was an article today or yesterday in the Reformer about OneCare and the fact that, you know, the costs are outweighing the benefits, but then, you know, the secretary or Mike Smith was saying how, well, that's not the full story, right? And also like this labeling around OneCare that is single payer. And I know that was sort of the idea of like what we were going towards, but it being just more complicated than that, right? Because then all of a sudden we have different markets based on what health insurance you're getting and who are you and how old are you, and like it's so complicated. So I think when we think about healthcare for all, it's almost like I think it's almost like too complicated. It's too convoluted. So I'm almost wondering, what is the Democratic Party's approach to this monster? Like, are we really trying to make it simpler? Are we trying to add more rules to it? Are we, you know, and I don't know that the public knows what we're trying to do, other than like, we hope one day everyone can have health insurance, right? Like that's, but like, what does that mean? So.
Good observation. Thank you. Tristan.
Thanks. I'm going to try not to get too into the policy side of this and away from values, since I know that we're talking about the party platform. But I'm just sticking within Vermont really for the moment. We created a system. We made a bet as a majority party under Shumlin and with democratically controlled House and Senate to build, well, OneCare is part of it, but also the Green Mountain Care Board, which is an extension of legislative authority. And we essentially bet on the large hospital systems, the distributed network that they can run. And so UVM up north, Dartmouth, Hitchcock, kind of in this region. But there are some anomalies. Grace Cottage is a powerfully organized anomaly in that system, but you know, that and do great work. But frankly, we bet our political fortunes on some interesting components about what healthcare should look like. And yeah, I appreciate what Emily is saying. It was created under a Democrat and implemented under a Republican, and that there is something really important to explore there. But also, I think from a values perspective, we know that this system we're trying to do something interesting. We're trying to focus on preventive care. We're trying to focus on containing the cost, the growth curve of the cost of healthcare, because that allows limited state dollars, limited federal dollars, and our private dollars to go further in creating an equitable system. We know that the healthcare outcomes for BIPOC individuals in our system are disproportionately bad, even though we have a level of managed care in a small system that I don't think is seen anywhere else in any other part of the country, and we still have terrible outcomes for our BIPOC populations in particular. And we haven't seen concrete evidence yet that of huge changes. There are some, I believe, some positive changes that we're seeing in the metrics that we've been measuring around the Blueprint for Health and other things that are important and have been helpful. But I think we really do still need to say, what does it mean to have an equitable healthcare system for everyone that is not going to force people into bankruptcy, not in enriching people in certain parts and impoverishing people in others. You know, that the hybrid system we have is a compromise that comes with being a governing majority, but is not yet attaining our value of equitable healthcare for all that is focused on preventative care and health, and not on harm reduction and sort of the end output of ill health.
So, excuse me, kind of back to Witchy's question then of, when people think about Democrats with healthcare, Obamacare is absolutely, to Liz's point, is not doing away with Obamacare, but what is, I'm just trying to think about the neighbors around me who, not unfortunately, but I'm on a very different healthcare system. So I'm not as tuned into what local people are thinking about their healthcare and what they think about the political parties vis-a-vis their healthcare. Is it something that it's something Democrats say, but the system's too complicated to really tie it down? Emily?
Frankly, it's the single issue that I hear about most whenever I do like significant constituent outreach beyond the usual circles. So knocking on doors, really like making phone calls. It is, and I think that's true for most of my colleagues across party. It's a top expense, unaffordable expense for most Vermonters and most Americans. Even though we have, expanded Medicaid here, and we have more, we've had more children receiving affordable health care than most other states and for longer. And politically, as a tiny state at this point, I think it feels politically unsolvable for a lot of Democrats. And so there's a trap there. There's like a trap in putting it in the platform. There's a trap in us trying to act on it. But there's also a real trap in pretending it's not a significant problem in most people's lives.
Yeah. It strikes me that when COVID hit, somehow we managed to get everyone shots for free and testing for free. And it seemed, I'm not quite certain if there was even money for treatment if you got COVID and ended up in the hospital. So it seems like there's very much, it's a political issue. It's political will, not operational constraint. Molly?
I was just going to say, like you could be more specific and say healthcare for all, and you could say the way we get there is universal primary care, something like that, which there are some bills floating around that. And, that sort of like biting off a little chunk of that huge healthcare for all topic.
Witchy?
Yeah, I hear Molly on the like steps towards sort of the bigger systems change, and I do agree that I think general governance, like when governing, I see that trend of like little by little we're building a thing that we're trying to get towards. And I also, want to go back to that political will during the pandemic. I think something that I've been saying a lot is that one of the greatest benefits during the pandemic of providing health services is that we didn't have to bill. Like we weren't worried about billing. We literally could just focus on making sure people knew where the shots were, got the shots, like actually call people to get the shots. It was like a whole different system. Yes, I think it's a little bit bigger than just saying universal primary care. It's also thinking about like in the universal primary care, how then do we make it easier for hospital billing departments to not be denied for the services that they're supposed to be universal. So just thinking also along those lines.
So there does seem to be two different issues in here as well, as back to kind of Tristan's point as well, is there's an access and there's a geographic access, and then there's this affordability question as well. One seems to be less partisan. I mean, the geographic access seems to be less of a political thing. Or am I wrong on that?
Well, how do you solve that problem is not exactly neutral.
True.
I want to line up behind Liz, but I believe that she's ahead of me in the
Okay.
queue.
Oh, go ahead, Liz.
I just wanted to mention that, getting doctors to move to Vermont is also something that's going to be increasingly of concern. There's a lot of doctors who are retiring, and not a lot of young doctors are coming here because of our, non-competitive pay scale. So that's just another factor that we need to consider when we're talking about expanding healthcare. We need doctors.
And psychiatrists.
Yes, across the board.
And and nursing at all levels.
Mhm.
It's there's an intersection here with the fact that this is a bugaboo of mine, and I apologize, but for sidetracking us out of healthcare, but we haven't had a very strong workforce strategy for a long time, and that persists under this governor. But the truth is, like, we know that these are national demographics on nursing, but also then as Liz said, there's specific obstacles for specific kinds of recruiting of different doctors in the system, and that's a huge obstacle for us. And there are really profound risks associated with that for the kind of safety and security that Vermonters need and expect from being able to live here. Like, you can't, it doesn't really work if you have to go 2 hours from a rural community to get any kind of real hospital care. And so we're at risk. Big parts of the state are at risk because of the macro trends around workforce, but also I was going to bring in that it does appear that the business models for smaller hospitals are also under, very much at risk. And so even though we're controlling budgets and we're doing a lot of things to control the system, a hospital like Brattleboro is very, very vulnerable because it does not have the unique protections that Grace Cottage has because of its geographic location. It has a strong population of Medicare and Medicaid. That federal program was vulnerable. It's too close to Bay State. It's too close to Keene. And it's not of a scale that protects it. But if we lost that, then a lot of besides the economic impact on the community, just the health access would be so much orders of magnitude more difficult for all of the rural areas around Brattleboro, not just in Brattleboro. And so we have to be paying attention to all of these things. It's like the system has to be resilient. And right now we're teetering on the edge of a lack of resiliency in the system, in addition to being equitable.
I saw Emily's request to drop the list, so I assumed you all have stared at it enough to know it. Tristan, kind of on that point, a lot of this seems to be almost like the system is what it is, and as parties, the best we can do is figure out the framing that's optimal for us, but it doesn't change the system. Is that what I'm getting?
Well, no, I mean, we have changed the system. We are changing. Every year we tweak our healthcare system. Absolutely. Whether, at the large scale, are we the most important player in changing the system? Probably not. The federal government is much more, impactful than we are with their funding streams. But what we do with the funding that they provide when it's flexible funding is very much up to us. And Medicaid reimbursement rates, which are tied in with, just to bring up an example of something that we've addressed a little bit over the last year and a half, the ambulance services, their reimbursement rates were really, really problematic. And Many of the calls that they were required to do in their roles were money losers for them. And so they spent substantial amounts of time fundraising to try to keep their operations going. Partly that's a function of us setting rates. We set the rates based on sort of the total budget container that we believe we want to operate in. So that's a political decision, and it reflects our values. And if our values are that we need a resilient system, not just a system, then one where they aren't a short revenue gap away from collapsing, which BMH could be at any given year, rescue could be, those kind of small, there's other hospitals that are losing money. Basically, UVM Medical Center was, and a couple others were the only ones that were net profit in the system. So that profit, while it looks ugly, is also their resilience, their ability to navigate short-term crises or to keep their facilities in good repair and be open. So it's something like we have to address resilience, not just and equity, or we lose access. If we don't have resilience, we will lose access.
Andy. You are muted, however.
Sorry for the delay. Looping back to the sort of big picture, which fits in exactly with what we were talking about. As many people do, I came from a Republican background, and I have family and friends who are Republicans and who just sort of shake their heads at what's been going on nationally and whatnot. They're not shaking them so much after the last presidency, but they have a strong prejudice against big business, a big company, big government rather. They say that government never does anything well. It always costs too much money, and it's better to leave it in the hands of people who know how to make money and how to spend money. I've heard it so often. And it seems to me that if we look at this pandemic and say, what can we learn from it? One of the things that we can learn from it is that despite everything, government does work. And if the government really concentrates on trying to accomplish something and draws the people together to do it across party lines, they can. And I think Vermont, I hope people are looking at the accomplishment of our little state up here, because it really is, it's extraordinary to me that we've done as well as we have.
Thank you, Andy. Anything else on healthcare?
Could I just offer one comment on Andy, piggybacking on something you just said, which is that honestly, I think part of the reason we've done as well as we have is that we care about governance, period. And that you look at some of the other states that really don't care about governance. It's not even just big government, but even in the smallest of ways, we actually take the responsibility seriously, that it's a social contract between the people and the institutions that they establish on their behalf to help govern them. And I think we live into that in a special way, and we should own it. We should own it as a party. We actually care, and we make a difference. And I think there's some wonderful Republican thinkers in the House, but guess what? The vast majority of them are dead weight. They don't care about governance. They're not contributing.
No,
They're there to be annoying.
You're saying, because I was going to ask you, were you talking at a national perspective, or were you talking?
I'm talking at the Vermont I'm staying at the Vermont perspective here, but in terms of how we reflect our values and our party platform in at the state level, that's one of the, like, standing for the difference of good governance. And frankly, Phil Scott benefits from how well we do it in the state, and he didn't screw it up. I think that's his single biggest skill, is that he didn't screw up the opportunity to be mediocre.
Liz.
The other thing that I was thinking of when Tristan was talking is like 30% of Republicans nationwide are refusing to be vaccinated. So that element of healthcare is also very telling. It's like denying science, denying the pandemic, denying the vaccines is all a weird phenomenon that I'll never understand, but it's a phenomenon that the Republicans own, and Democrats have an advantage in, a life-saving vaccine.
Andy?
It seems to me that this also ties in with the question of education for all. It just seems to me it's very strange that we do so little to educate young people and older people in the advantages of our political system. And we can be very proud to say, look at what Vermont can do. It is possible for people to work across party barriers. We do not have to be polarized. We can work together on important issues. We can spend money, but carefully, without beggaring the economy. It's extremely important. And I've spent ever so many years as a publisher and as a teacher trying to get the concepts of our governmental and political system across to people. And as I get ready to retire, I feel somewhat defeated. Not that what anything that I could have ever done could have put off the Trump wave, but there is this terrible lack of understanding of the importance of government. And maybe we're not, it's always a matter of what you're spending money on, but maybe we're really not caring enough in our educational systems to teach people in a dynamic way, a very personal way, about the importance of our political system. And that is something which I think we as Democrats can strongly, that's a flag we can hold up and say, we've done a good job.
Thanks, Andy. Witchy.
Yeah, Andy, you took the words right out of my mouth when you talked about education. One of the things during the pandemic, at least when I worked with the BIPOC population, to try to get people who were hesitant about vaccines to get the vaccines, it was just merely like, let's have a conversation with like a provider that knows about vaccines and how effective they are, and like what are all the different myths out there and what's actually true and what's not, and just being able to provide that opportunity was really essential to help that. I think something that you said I think is one of those double-edged swords that I just want to cite, and I want to bring it back to education again. And that is reaching across party lines. I wholeheartedly agree that I think when we want to get things done, we have to get them done together. That takes conversation, that takes collaboration, that takes active listening. I think we have to be careful though, as a party, where the line is between we're actively listening and actively trying to collaborate and being complicit in denying justice and really denying the values that we stand for. And looping back to education, I do think that reaching across party lines is also about helping young people, about helping frankly, everyone on how to actively listen, on how to make ethical decisions, on how to be able to be involved civically. And I think, I agree that I think with education, we can do a lot more collaboration. We can talk a lot more. We can listen a lot more.
Which I took to your line about reaching across party lines means also knowing very clearly what those lines are that you're reaching across. So kind of being true to our own values as we're trying to find that space. Molly.
Yeah, I was on the topic of education. I have talked to a few young people lately who will not get vaccinated, and they're not Republicans. And it just shocks me, you know. Well, one person saying, well, I don't really trust the government. And you know, the other person saying, well, I've done a lot of reading on this, and I'm just not sure it's safe. And it's just like, these are really intelligent people. And how do you get that, you know, that trust? And one of them even said, well, besides, Vermont is safe anyway. And he said, it's safe because we all got vaccinated. You know, that sort of sense of being part of the whole, like, you know, we're all in this together. It's not, you know, that sort of, well, I'm just going to have my own ideas because I feel like, you know, I don't really trust them. And I think that education around the, you know, the values of community and the values of, you know, paying attention to science and really listening to people who really know what they're talking about. So,
Okay.
very discouraging.
Thank you, Molly. Emily.
I very much agree that education is incredibly important at all levels for creating the environment for a solid civil society. But I think a lot of Vermonters don't believe or know about the possible power of government because they have been living their lives in a Vermont and in a country that has changed from Democrat to Republican, Republican to Democrat many times throughout their life, and they have seen no material changes or gains in their quality of life throughout that time. And so the natural reaction is to say, like, none of that matters to my life at all because I just keep on having to do what I have to do and things just keep on getting a little bit harder every year. And so I think those are rational decisions that people are, rational educated decisions that people are making to not care about any of this on some level, given their life experiences. And so I think we do a really good job as Democrats talking very broadly and very deeply about policy issues, but I think we need to get much better at being concrete about what that prosperity really feels like in people's lives and what real government access feels like in people's lives. One sort of very tangible example of that is I post on social media fairly constantly. I work really hard to get stuff out about what's going on. I posted about the DMV possibly closing in Dummerston, and like, I'm like the most popular politician in town now. Everyone's so excited that I just told them to call the governor. Like, that's what, like,
Yeah.
So it's, people just want their lives to work. And if Democrats can make their lives work, then that's great. And if Republicans can make their lives work, then that's great. And right now, no one is making their lives work, and that's ungreat. And I feel like that's what so much of this comes down to. And the rest of it is just spin.
Yeah. You know, that's kind of, and I know we can get into these large discussions, which we have, but Emily, you're grounding us right back to the original point of this, which is when people are sitting around the kitchen table talking about what are the issues that are important to them. I'm not expecting them to say, thank God for the Democrats because of this, but boy, it would be nice if they said, thank God for the Democrats because they were the ones who made sure our DMV stayed here. My Democratic rep did that. And this kind of leads us into the organizational discussion a little bit, which is Dave Levenbach and I started this discussion before you all came on about how party identity in Vermont is very squishy. You know, you don't register with a party. Even my advertising for this was if you vote Democrat or lean towards Democratic policy. And so I really want to kind of move into that organizational part because I want to give a little time for that. But is there anything else on the planks that anyone wanted to discuss before we shift framing? Liz?
To Emily's point, the fact that no Republican voted for that last care package
Mhm.
is an important part to be driving home.
We have, yeah.
Because
we've
that
talked about-
affects everybody's life.
And that, I mean, the challenge of that is, the irony is the governor is the one who signs the bill at the end of the day. But I think we've done a pretty good job, at least in the public media, of highlighting that this has been Democrats. Let me jump over to Andy's big tent issue, because that's one I really was hoping we could explore, and we have a great group to do that with here, which is when Democrats talk about being the big tent party, what exactly does that look like? What does that even mean? How does it show up? How do people feel welcome, whether they're coming in from one side or the other? How are we doing here in Windham County of being a big tent party? Liz?
I just get the sense that most of the people are Democrats in Windham County, and you'd have to really opt out of that thinking to be a Republican, because the people I know who are Republicans are a very us and them type of people who self-segregate themselves out of the people and choose to be separated from the whole of the population.
So you're saying our Republicans are our counterculture?
You can say that, but I just think that they are the ones who are opting out. And I think that the complacency of the Democrats or the complacency of the population has a lot to do with Emily just talked about, but it's the Republicans who've been better organized for the past 40 years. And the Democrats are like, la, la, la. And now I think is a really pivotal time for Democrats to understand what government can mean to them and to be a part of the whole, as opposed to separating yourself out as the Republicans constantly do.
Andy?
Well, I reflect back on a couple of efforts that we made now years ago, but there was a point at which we held open quotes, debates. I guess it's more what we call these days a town hall meeting or whatnot, in which we really actively encouraged candidates from all parties to come and talk about issues. And we managed to get them to come and talk seriously about issues. I don't know that that people changed votes particularly. I'm sure it did have some effect on their understanding of the political process, but it seemed like a big tent that the Democrats, and I can't actually tell you whether it was when Howard Dean was running or it was at one of the, some time ago, when we put up the tent and had a sort of political democratic revival, inviting people of all different opinions to come in and discuss things. And it hasn't happened much. We've gotten more sort of fragmented and I remember again, several years ago when we had a situation where we had in Brattleboro, we had a Democratic office that we rented. And we refused to have any progressive candidates have anything to do with it. We wouldn't show their signs. We wouldn't, they were shunned. And even though they were, to some extent, they agreed with many of the policies, we just weren't, we were trying to purify what we were doing.
Okay, so attempts to purify is a key issue. Witchy. Oh, you're muted.
Took it down.
Oh, thank you.
Every Zoom session. I like it. I think Liz had a response specifically to that. I don't remember.
Oh, thank you, which yeah, I did. I just wanted to mention, Andy, that that whole thing with the progressives, that was whether or not that political candidate opted in for state funding. And it wasn't as broadly a shunning. It was whether or not you were participating in the state Democratic Party's campaign process. So it was more of an accounting issue than a political issue, but certain candidates chose not to participate, and therefore their paraphernalia could not be given out at the headquarters.
I remember that, and I agree. And it's too bad it developed the way it did, because I think it alienated a lot of people from the whole process. And I've heard from them over the years.
Well, maybe that.
Liz, you muted.
Yeah, a lot of that I think has to do with the candidate themselves.
Yep.
I'm sorry. So go ahead, Witchy.
Yeah, let me go back to Witchy.
Yeah, thank you. I have a few different thoughts. I'm gonna try to weave them together. Just first on this whole big tent idea of who the Democratic Party is. I think sort of from like a high level view, I think the Democratic Party is that kind of like, let's invite everyone in and let's like all be like together. And and I think like in some kind of world that's great. But I think when it comes down to the real world, it's that, you know, you can't please everyone and you shouldn't expect to please everyone. And I feel like for it's important to know like who we are and what we represent and who we want to represent, and have, and obviously reflected for the people from the people that are wanting to have that party, and then just have it be filled with that party rather than trying to play all the lines and trying to bring everyone in. I do think conversation is important, obviously. Like, I don't think we should be shutting anyone out, but I do think that, you know, just trying to take a book from like understanding the public, and that, you know, not everyone's going to be pleased, and we just have to accept that as a reality. And I think, you know, on that, I think the Democratic Party has a little bit of a PR issue. Like we seem like that way, that we want to accept everyone, but we're really like, sometimes it goes towards ways that, you know, people don't necessarily like, or it looks bad, and then like the Democratic Party doesn't necessarily do anything to change that view, and especially because everyone's frustrated with a two-party system, so then all of a sudden, ooh, progressives, right? Like, you know, or I'm not going to be a Democrat, I'm going to be a Republican, right? So all of a sudden we automatically create those segregation because of the optics, because of the image we're presenting, because of the ambiguity we present with sort of trying to be a big tent. And then going back to Andy's idea about the town halls, I think town halls are a fabulous idea to gather people's opinions. And I think something that has been powerful in the time that I've been here is actually the Democratic Party and people from the Democratic Party going to town halls that are hosted by others. Like at the Out in the Open had an LGBTQ plus town hall, and that's actually where I met, you know, Becca Ballant, for example, because they showed up. Or like, you know, I met Jeanette White at the Meet the Legislators by the BDCC. And I think those are really powerful ways to really, one, get that really one-to-one interaction with, and Tristan, actually, I met you there too, and get that one-to-one interaction, and also create a pipeline and also like shape the optics. So I want to hold that town hall idea expanded a little bit and just think about that. That could be a powerful way to approach folks.
Excellent. Thank you. Emily.
I really appreciate how broad our tent is down here. I think that it gives me permission personally to be like quite sort of politically policy far left while maybe strategically slightly more centrist. And I think, you know, I think it gives us all the ability to weave together like the complexity that is politics and policy. And I'm just using myself as an example. And I think that's true for most of the legislators that you'll see from our county, that none of us are sort of like a straight and tidy party member, whether we're Democrats or progressives, you know, first, but that we weave together pieces of each in a way, and even, you know, some of us a little snippets of independents or Republicans, because that's how we sort of both imagine our communities want us to show up and how we think we can be most effective. And I think that makes our community richer and makes sort of our politically party more viable in some ways. But I also think that we need to be held as elected representatives who are part of the party more accountable to the party sometimes, or more accountable to the platform sometimes, or more accountable to the county party. I think often because we are loud and comfortable and participate a lot and think about these things for many hours of the day, we dominate conversations like this one, like I'm doing right now. And that means that other folks don't really like that we drive the conversation as electeds rather than having community members drive the conversation and us follow. And I think for me, the big tent only works if it's the community that's driving the big tent, not the legislators driving the big tent. But I like my gratitude that we are not this like incredibly divisive county around around party affiliations, and like is just top of my list of things I deeply, deeply appreciate about Windham County.
Thanks, Emily. I'm going to get to Tristan in a minute. I did want to point out one challenge I feel sometimes as a county chair, which is that figuring out what the identity is of who. Sometimes a big tent can get so big, or could be so big, that people don't know if they're in or out of the tent. So I always think back to what's that center pole, and the thought being, if you can see the center pole, you're in the tent. What does that look like? Tristan.
So I have a coworker who lives here in town, Mexican American, and his wife has a part-time job, and they're expecting, and they just figured out that they're going to get 4 weeks of paid support from the institution she works at. And I was reminded in that moment that 2 years ago, we had a veto override vote on paid family leave in Vermont that would have been about to come online right now, and would have given them 12 weeks, or maybe in the worst imaginable scenario, 8 weeks. And we lost that veto override vote by 1 vote. And we had 3 Democrats vote with the governor, two of them voting from a position of blue dog moderation, this is too expensive, and one from the left saying it wasn't pure and good enough. And it strikes me that that's the perfect example of the double-edged nature of what it means to be a big tent party. That we needed, frankly, we needed an extra 2 or 3 Democrats in that conversation. Even if they had been blue dogs, we might have found out of that extra 2 or 3, one of them who was willing to go along with us on that ride. And this was, great collaboration from the Progressive Party and the Democratic Party and some moderate Republicans who understood the value of this work. But it's also the case that there are districts in Vermont, at least in the House, where the district is pretty darn blue doggy. And we lost a progressive caucus leader a couple years ago. And boy, like the person that they sent to replace him was not strong, is not contributing a substantial amount to the work of the body. Unless somebody else disagrees with me, but I suspect not on this call. But it says something about the district that, Robin, for instance, as a progressive leader, was really engaging, really thoughtful, strong on progressive ideas, but the district was going a different direction. And so it's like we have to run in the context that we're in and speak to, meet people where they are. We will, and it's a luxury in Windham County, or at least in Brattleboro for us, that where we are as individual leaders is really well matched to where the largest block of voters is in our community. That's a tremendous luxury. It gives us a little bit of space to breathe and to really focus our policy work and to try to make strategic choices. But in a lot of places, to be a big tent means that we've got to meet those communities where they are, with people who understand and are understood in their communities.
Tristan, let me, I was thinking about what you were saying, and this has always been a challenge of Windham County being all Democrat or Democrat leaning, is it is hard to overcome sometimes that, someone called it the complacency of, well, we're all good here, so why participate if everything's running fine? How do, firing up people to show up for a meeting or to organize or to even be part of the conversation of why we need Democrats and more Democrats in the House can be very difficult when it feels like everything down here is going well. I'm trying to think of what is that narrative that why we want people engaged. I think we're getting it now. Actually, I think the Republicans are providing, and I was sitting in on the Newfane Town Select Board meeting last night, and that was pretty clear why Democrats need to be more active in their own towns, attending and just being good citizens of attending their select board meetings, if for no other reason than to keep the right wing from dominating the narrative at the moment.
I have to say, this is going to be super geeky, but I think everyone in this audience already expects that of me. So not audience, but everybody in the call here and knows this of me. But I'm really struck by 2 large macro trends that are, I think, powerfully affecting the nature of politics in our region. And one of those is that for 40 years or more, good governance in Montpelier has been to take more and more of the decision-making away from local communities, which means that the committees and all of the places that people used to plug in, there's less and less for those committees to do. In Brattleboro with our representative town meeting, we no longer are talking about the schools because we went through Act 46. There are just different ways that with the best of intentions over time, more and more is being decided elsewhere. And when more and more is being decided elsewhere, and you can't have as much of an impact on the process, your attention goes elsewhere. People don't tend to volunteer their time and attention to things that they don't feel like they'll have an impact in doing. And you couple that with a tremendous shift in the amount of information people are able to access globally around the news, but the collapse of local news. And there really isn't the kind of steady place to be visible for these issues to surface in a way that creates kind of shared understanding and, maybe triggers an incentive for people on different sides of issues to get more active in addressing them. And we have a great local weekly, and I know the Reformer is trying, but the truth is that the level of engagement at the local level on news is very different than it was 25 years ago, 30 years ago.
Richie.
I know I said it on chat, but I gotta say, I really appreciate all of the valuable insight that I'm learning from so much of you, especially sort of like the historical context of how things are different now than they have been. And I think something, at least just from being on the ground, sort of to Tristan's point, it's like there's so many different groups of folks trying to do so many different political things. I do think, though, in that kind of model where so many things are being done almost like in a segregated way, we're not necessarily talking to each other. I think there's an opportunity to actually talk to each other. I think for me, for example, I've been talking to the West River Valley Mutual Aid Group and talking about, what's happening in the Newfane Select Board, or what happens with the Townsend Select Board with the Negro Brook, or what, what's happening in Brattleboro with the community safety review. And I mean, I think from what I've seen, it's hard for elected officials to be that involved, and y'all have a lot of work on you. But I do think that there is opportunity to be engaged in those conversations and at least offer support, at least offer consulting, or like, hey, there's this person that I know that can help you. And at least just being in those meetings when they happen, even if you're not taking on work, and you can be transparent about not taking on work. So yeah, again, I think everyone's pretty stretched thin, but I do think, again, there's an opportunity to especially like be bringing people into sort of this idea of a party with the local things that are happening.
Richie, that's a great point. It feeds directly off of what Tristan said, which is, given that there's not that much of the media out there, as there used to be local media, the party just engaging with other groups creates kind of a froth of conversation that you can see, okay, here's ideas being teased out and tested and connected and contrasted. And maybe our party, one of its core things should be, how do we generate those conversations? Not so much to come up with the results, the policy results, but just to get the ideas out there. And in a way, this is what kind of articulates what I'm trying to do with these county conversations, is that exact kind of discussion of where, what comes out of this. It doesn't have to be a policy result, it could just be insight. So on that note, I'm sorry, I was reading Molly's chat. I just wanted to say, the new reporter for the Reformer who's doing the political work, he's pretty comprehensive. I'm kind of enjoying it.
The Speaker of the House and the Speaker's Chief of Staff said that they spend more time with him than any other reporter.
Yeah. I think he's a gem. He's kind of.
And, Chris Mays is the reporter at the Reformer who handles all the select board meetings, the planning commission. I don't know about the school board, but there is a person who does that at the Reformer.
What I meant was there used to be like one person for each meeting,
Oh yeah.
the level that they
yeah.
had, yeah.
Well,
I'm not saying he doesn't do it, and Chris does a great job.
yeah.
I just meant that they had so many different people on different beats. That's all.
So I wanted to go once around to everyone, give everyone an opportunity to have a closing thought, and then I just had a request at the very end. Bob Ozier, I wanted to start with you because you've been kind of listening in, and I always value your insight. So anything of this that really comes out or really struck you as engaging?
I always wonder whether you can hear me or not, so.
Or you can hear you, but you got to speak up a little.
I'll put the, uh, put the video off. Just following up with what Andy said about the town hall concept and maybe focusing on an issue to bring people in. I think what sometimes happens is that people get excited about issues after the decisions have already been made. And it's been publicized and it's out there. And if there's a way that we could get to an issue before there's been a decision, maybe that's a point, maybe that's a hook to bring people together. The one thing that I've been thinking about, which I think is too late to talk about, and it hits a lot of the planks, is the whole housing issue. That, you know, because of the pandemic, we solved homelessness. And we did, except June 30th is coming. And it will impact everything. It will impact justice, community safety. It'll impact environment. It will impact a lot of things. We're now talking, well, I don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole, but that's an issue, but that issue may be already too late because I think the decisions have already been made. But the concept of getting a concept out there and maybe bringing people together on that.
Thanks. It's a great point. And really, this is the time to do it before the legislative session because it gives individuals a chance to contribute. And then they actually would be like, hey, we were talking about this summer and now the legislature is doing something with it. It gives people a sense of agency. So very much. Andy.
I heard a bit of news the other day that struck me as being more than interesting. And that is that there's been a lot of money put behind an effort in immigration, choosing 2 towns in the United States to receive a great many Ethiopians. And Brattleboro was one of them in the whole United States. And I was wondering, you know, just imagining what we must look like in the perspective of the person looking for various towns. It obviously doesn't want to be a great big town. It wants to be a town where there's a need for people to work at a local blue collar, or eventually, you know, just increasing the number of workers in the community. And I'm sure it isn't just a question of Brattleboro. Their vision must go beyond that to reach out into Windham County in some ways. It has a lot to do with the tremendous tradition that we have in this community for teaching people to speak English and helping them to be engaged in the community. I think the experiment with many years of involvement worldwide has a lot we can be grateful for. But I think to Bob's point is right smack on it, of course. You know, if they decide to bring in 15 or 20 or 40 families from Ethiopia, the percentage of people who are white in the United States may change. I mean, in Vermont, that we may not be the whitest state anymore. Not that all Ethiopians are black, but most of them are, as I understand it. I haven't been there, but that is a marvelous thing for people to think about beforehand. What if that's going to evolve? How's it going to be handled? somebody, may have been Betty Fry, I can't remember, somebody came up with the idea not long ago that the School for International Training property up there, which is really not being used much, maybe it's being used a little bit more this summer, would be a fantastic place to work with bringing immigrants in and helping them be educated and in a fairly intensive way, and then bringing them into and engaging them in the community.
Okay.
Maybe we can do that as a community, but we shouldn't be led blind. We shouldn't just have it happen, blow up in our face. I think Bob's point is right on. I think bringing issues up beforehand is really important.
All right. Thank you. Molly, you're next on my screen here.
Oh, well, to that point, I was just listening to BPR today at noon, and there was a program on intersectionality, but at the end, they were talking to Paivon, who grew up, she was in your class, right, Tristan, or around there. She and her family came from Laos and were sponsored here. And she talked about, in contrast to some of the other people on the program who were people of color, that her experience of growing up in Brattleboro was very positive, because there had been so many people who had been in the Peace Corps, so many people who had traveled abroad because of, the School for International Training. It was just a really interesting comment. She lives now up in Barrie, and is a writer, poet, and I'm not sure what she did work for Digger. I'm not sure what she's doing now. Anyway, just thinking about our community and how grateful I am, and as Emily said, to live here and be sort of aligned with the values of most of the people who are here. So
Thank you.
thank you for this conversation.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, Molly. Liz.
I want to thank everybody for this conversation too. It's been great. And, there were 50 people on that call about, investing in having an immigrant population come. And one of the main thrusts was that we have to deal with our existing population and the scarcity of resources that they have, especially housing and everything else, so that we can become welcoming to others and not feel threatened. And I think that was really the salient point as we go forward.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Witchy.
Yeah, I also want to thank y'all for letting me be here in this space. And I decided a little while ago, and definitely planning to grow old here, and one of the main reasons is because how empowering it is to be here. I think everyone just letting me be in these tables, letting me have my opinion, listening, actually like letting me collaborate. It's just been so powerful for me to feel this, and I want everyone here to just like pat yourself in the back, just knowing that you are part of this process. And to Liz's point, I think we got to make sure that when we do welcome others, we welcome others with open arms, that we're empowering others, and empowering others not just to be in the rooms where decisions are made, but also with resources. I agree, housing, transportation, broadband, and these are not just going to be our issues, but those are going to be the issues of all Vermonters that are coming. Just we need to keep doing the work as best as we can, always keeping the future in mind.
Thank you. David Levenbach.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything much to add, but I do thank people for all their interesting comments. Appreciate their participation.
Thanks, David. Emily?
I'm really glad to be here. And I would appreciate if people could keep on thinking about that idea of including people in generative conversations, because I believe in that as a concept, and yet I struggle deeply to get anyone, except for really some of the 8 of you, to show up at something that's a generative rather than a reactive conversation. So I know Bob will always show up at a generative conversation. but getting other people there is really, really hard. And so like if everyone in this room could really continue to put their heads together on how to do that, I think we would be much better off. But I think we need to do more than just say we're going to do it. We need to figure out how to get, people to participate.
So, thank you. Tristan.
Thank you. Second what Emily just said. Parenthetically, this only really works for Brattleboro in my experience, but I have been startled by how many people tell me they've seen me on television when I've done anything on BCTV. And so for Brattleboro-based folk, I think there's that is an opportunity that we aren't really taking advantage of being on there consistently, or at least maybe not systemically, like some Emily may be on there often, or I don't know. Like if your Montpelier Happy Hour is all podcast based, or is that a show? You're there every week, yeah. But it's not broadly shared for us, but that is a place where in the majority population center, there's an opportunity to do more structurally. And Bob, thank you for bringing up housing. Bob and I spent a chunk of time on Saturday hanging out, talking about housing, among other things. And it's going to be such an important topic going forward. I would love for us as Democrats to broaden the conversation of housing beyond just the affordable housing and sort of state policy around affordable housing, which is we often get bogged down in legislatively. The need is much greater than state government by itself will ever be able to fund. And so it has to be some combination of public-private. And so let's start talking about what that looks like and how to be more creative in how we approach that problem. That the lack of housing is going to be a real detriment for us at trying to turn some of the demographic curves that that we want to change. And it's hard to be inclusive, as Liz said, if we don't have anywhere for people to go. And so that there's some we're facing a constraint on our system that isn't where our values or our aspirations are, but maybe a hard, cold reality that we need to work together to figure out how we're going to change. And I appreciate the conversation. And yeah, that's it. Thank you, John.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you everyone for attending. I just have two final requests for you. One is back to Emily's point about how difficult it is to include people in generative conversations to get them going. This was my attempt, my first run on this. You are going to get an email from me tomorrow just asking you to be very blunt and what worked for you, what didn't work, because I have 8 more of these sessions and I want to be able to tease out more of the next sessions, and knowing what your experiences were with this and where you saw it as value and where you're not is going to help me be better at asking guiding questions. And then the second part of that is if you would share, we'll be doing this again next Tuesday, and then 6 or 7 Tuesdays following that after the 4th of July weekend. Help me promote this out there, because I would like to continue this conversation. You're more than welcome to attend another session if you want to, absolutely. But I really do appreciate you attending tonight and kind of helping me get this started. So on that note, I'm also going to be more mindful of my time in the future. I'm way over, so I got to be mindful of watching that. I apologize. Have a good night, everyone. Appreciate your time.